Welcome to episode 1 of Elves, Rings, and Nerdy Things. My name is Sean Briggs, and my co-host for this brand new podcast is Sam Marvin. Introduce himself quick.
Evening, Sean. Good to see you. Hello, everybody. I am Sam Marvin, co-host of Elves, Rings, and Nerdy Things. We are two brothers-in-law, each of whom are big fans of Tolkien's Legendarium, and following the release of the Rings of Power show on Amazon, decided to capture our conversations in the form of a podcast and share them with you. And we think that will be valuable. And Sean would like to talk a little bit more about why that is.
Yeah, especially with the Rings of Power coming out, there's a lot of voices all giving opinions, discussing Tolkien's works. Sam and I just wanted to add our melody to the discordant tune. More or less, these are conversations that we normally have anyway, and we're bored and want to make sense of Rings of Power as the episodes are coming out. It's been, oh gosh, when was the last Hobbit film released? 2014, 15, somewhere in there?
Something like that.
So it's been 8 years since the last Tolkien-related piece of media has come out. So to be able to walk through this and kind of talk about it with someone else is going to be good for me, at least.
I think one of the things that we hope makes this podcast different from other either podcasts or YouTube channels out there is that while both of us we've read the Lord of the Rings, we've read the Silmarillion, we've read the Hobbit, we've seen the Peter Jackson movies, we've seen the Hobbit movies. I think we've both seen the animated Hobbit, which is one of my all-time favorites. I wouldn't say either of us are purists of Tolkien purists. And in addition to that, we're both fans of Dungeons and Dragons, other fantasy properties, and it's useful to kind of put the Rings of Power in its modern context as an audience member. And so one of the things that we hope to do is comment on the show, not just from the perspective of two people who are fans of the books, but also from two people who are fans of fantasy in general. And we think that will maybe highlight some things that are either underappreciated or maybe overly criticized. We're not going to be cheerleaders universally for the show. I think as with everything, there's some good, there's some bad, and there's some interesting conversation in between.
There's definitely some things about the show that I hate, and we will talk about that when the things come up. But I think the important thing is once we run out of episodes for Rings of Power, the end of our title is "and nerdy things." So that will encompass other things like The Witcher, Renaissance fairs, as Sam said, Dungeons and Dragons. So there's a whole bunch of other stuff that we're going to be able to talk about, even though Tolkien is probably going to be the main focus, I feel, in a lot of our conversations, something that we come back to episode after episode. But yeah, we're just looking forward to being able to talk. And even if no one listens, it's for Sam and I to make sense of what we're watching and just be able to voice our opinions on it. Yeah.
Well, at the very least, I think Haley will listen. She has to. My wife, your sister, the reason that we know each other, the reason that we're here. So let's jump into our recap of season 1, episode 1, titled The Shadow of the Past. Sean, why don't you lay it out for us?
So we have a couple groups that we follow in the first episode. We have a cold open Galadriel, very similar to Fellowship of the Ring, Peter Jackson's trilogy. Her with a narration painting over some thematic visuals. But as the episode goes on, we basically follow Galadriel. We have the Harfoots and a storyline with Arondir and Tir Harad. Galadriel, the first time we see her is an infant or a youthful Galadriel in the lands of Valinor, which I do have to say, as a quick pause, was one of my highlights of the episode. Being able to see Valinor, we see Fenrod, her older brother, we see the two trees, just images that I didn't think we would ever be able to see in any visual TV or film. And to be able to see them was, I thought, stunning. I really enjoyed the visuals, especially in Valinor.
Yeah, when Finrod is walking across that hill and it crests and you can see in the background the hint of the trees, and obviously it zooms in later on, but then that city is that Tyrion, the city that we're looking down on. I don't know if here's the other thing about the show is that there are things that are displayed on screen that go unnamed that book readers and other fans will be able to, they'll recognize it. They'll know the name. They'll know who that is. They'll know the character before the character is named, and they'll have all the significance attached to it. But one thing I want to come back to is, does somebody who is not familiar with the Silmarillion or with the Unfinished Tales or with any of the other books in the Legendarium, does that viewer recognize those things? And does the show do a sufficient job of establishing why those things are important? I think that's one of the things I'd like to continue to kind of come back to, especially when it comes to the things that the producers don't have the rights to, right? We know that they didn't have the rights to the Silmarillion. Some stuff from the Silmarillion is in the show. Certain things are maybe shown on screen that are not talked about in the way that the Silmarillion had described them. But I didn't mean to cut into your
Oh no, you're
recap.
good. Yeah, but part of that too is just the anger over the show. I think that's one of the things that we want to talk about in this podcast is how we believe it's somewhat misplaced. I think you have to be able to have the lens. We can't be upset that they don't show the Oath of Feanor, right? Because it's in the Silmarillion. It's a huge part of the books. And that was one of the things that really upset me the first in episode 1. And this will continue into the recap. We then, after the conversation with Finrod and Galadriel, we move into why did they come back to Middle Earth? And the show paints that out to be the light of the trees was stolen. The elves were upset. They declared war on Morgoth and followed him to Middle Earth. When the first episode came out last Friday and I was watching it, I was really bothered that they completely just overlooked the Oath of Feanor, the Silmarils, the kinslaying, all these different reasons. But then I realized they don't have the rights to the Silmarillion. So I had to change my lens, realize that this is not going to be, in a perfect world, would we be getting a show that they had the rights to the Silmarillion? Yes, that would be the perfect scenario, but that's not the one we're living in. So I'm going to temper expectations and let them tell me a story. That's where I'm at with the conversation of rights. I'm going to enjoy it for what it is. That was my first real foray into being bothered by the show, but quickly got over that probably 3 days later.
3 days later, 2 rewatches, and you're over the Silmarillion not being included. I mean, this is a little bit of a fast forward to a second episode in season 1 where we actually name check the Silmarils and Feanor, something that I did not think we would get, again, based on the Silmarillion not being part of the license that was received by Amazon, but then also because it was not featured in episode 1 in the prologue. Looking ahead, knowing that they did that in episode 2, knowing they established with the prologue, I will say I also did a little bit of IMDb scouting, and I think the actress that plays young Galadriel is credited in 7 episodes. So it is likely that we're going to get additional either flashbacks or, if not flashbacks, narration, commentary, dialogue about the history of the First Age. So maybe we will get more of the Silmarillion content later on, especially as we talk about Celebrimbor and his relationship with Elrond and Galadriel, and then eventually, with Sauron entering the picture as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so episode 1, we are now in Middle Earth. Galadriel is an adult. She is leading a group of commandos in the north. Again, this is another issue we will save for the meta criticisms, I think, of Galadriel, her character in general, and how they've altered her a lot of bit. But again, another scene that I found stunning. We got to see what may be Utumno in the far north, and which is one of Melkor's seats of power in Middle Earth. That shot where they're going through the snow, and then you see the lightning and the outline of the peaks of. I almost completely rebounded from my anger of the lack of info from Silmarillion by that one shot. Personally, very brief. We fight a cave troll, or a snow troll.
Snow troll, yeah.
We see the sign of Sauron, that symbol that he keeps leaving all over, that was left on Finrod's body. Almost a mutiny.
I wrote down in my notes, I wrote mutiny. That was a straight up mutiny. There was swords were drawn, swords were laid on the ground, and to an elf, they refused to go on. Something that I think we should talk about in kind of the general discussion post recap of the character of Galadriel. But then also I think there's some some screenwriting comments that I'd like to make about the mutiny scene as well.
Okay.
And that whole initial opening scene of the Elven commandos.
Yeah, and then I don't know verbatim after the commando scene. I believe we either go to the Harfoots for the first time or Tirharad with Arondir and Bronwyn.
I'll pick up the recap. I'll just looking at my notes here. After the mutiny, we do cut to the two hunters, the two human hunters walking, and then that quickly cuts to or transitions to kind of the snippet of the Harfoot life. We're introduced to Nori, who is pretty much she's the main Harfoot character. Her family, her friends, some of the other children, they go berry picking and they see a wolf print, and that is kind of the sign for Nori and her friend Poppy to round up the other young Harfoot children and go back to camp.
She is our Frodo / Bilbo of
yes.
She is the hobbit that wants a life of adventure.
Correct. And I don't know if we get her desire for adventure dialogue at that point or if it comes down later. I will say right now this is a problem spot for me. Is I really have to pay attention hard to the Harfoot dialogue and the plot line, because it's a little hard to get over some of the portrayals that we're getting. I think the accents are a little goofy. Some of the costuming is a little distracting. And yeah, well, that'll be something that we talk about. I think that's also something that's in a lot of the criticisms that you see out elsewhere, both kind of your media, some of your media criticisms, then also some other just kind of armchair commentators. Want me to keep going?
Sure.
Okay, so then we come back to Linden and we meet Elrond for the first time, and this leads into the next part of the Galadriel storyline, where there is a ceremony honoring Galadriel and her fellow commandos, in which Gil-galad, who is the High King of the elves in Middle Earth, announces that they will be rewarded with passage to Valinor, the Undying Lands, which is met with a lot of happiness with the other elves, but Galadriel resists. She and Elrond have another conversation in which she needs to maintain her position that Sauron is still out there and her desire to continue hunting him. Elrond makes it clear that that is not going to happen, but if it is made clear, if they've discovered that Sauron is still in the world, that he will pick up her search to find him and resist him. That seems to assuage her, and for the time being at least, she moves ahead with the plan, the voyage to Valinor.
This is another one of our Easter eggs for Silmarillion fans. The trees, they make memorials to the fallen elves, and she's at the tree at the memorial of Finrod when she's talking to Elrond in the scene. But as they cut around, you can see other trees, and I believe the one in particular that I noted was the Hound, which looked like a Luthien. But there were a few others that other viewers and other recappers have noted as well. But they are making an effort, at least, to engage the more diehard fans who would be able to see something like that and then get the reference. So at least props to the showrunners for including Easter eggs for the bigger fans to latch onto.
So that's an interesting point that you bring up, because I missed that the first time through. The Luthien and Huan, the Hound of Valinor, in that living tree sculpture. Second time through, I noticed it, and I also noticed another figure who was holding a staff, or what maybe was a shaft of a spear. That could, in my mind, I think that's Fingon, maybe Fingolfin, probably Fingon, who was another former king of the elves in the First Age, led the fight against Morgoth, died resisting him. But to your point, if they're adding these little nods to book readers who are going to recognize Luthien and Huan, who are going to recognize, Fingon or Fingolfin, who even know who those characters are because they're not mentioned in between the characters in the show, that is going to be a reference that is picked up on by certain book fans. But that is also seemingly the core audience. It's not the core audience. That seemingly is the core group of people who are reacting so negatively to this show. So what we can try to do is lift up how people who are getting those references can also enjoy the show and continue to like the books for what they are, love the books for what they are, but to also enjoy the show for what it is.
Because I will say, and I was going to save this for the meta criticisms, but I think one of my biggest critiques of the showrunners at this point, they don't have the rights to the Silmarillion. And I don't like changing lore to the point of having it be blatant that things are changed if you've read the Silmarillion. they've done things that make it where they don't tell you everything, like, or make it close enough to where it's not blatantly against lore. They have a great example of it with Finrod. He dies in the Silmarillion. He dies with Beren when Beren is trying to get the Silmaril for Luthien, killed by Sauron. In the show, Finrod killed by Sauron. The only thing that I wish they wouldn't have given as much detail on is Finrod going out to find Sauron and getting killed for it. I wish they would have just said Finrod was killed by Sauron. Galadriel then, in an act of revenge, wants to seek justice, or whatever you want to call it. The moment they begin to make these changes that just don't make sense to the diehard fans is why they're all going up in arms about the show.
Yeah.
And they're saying, oh, Tolkien's legacy, and they're so disrespectful, and he's rolling over in his grave, which I find ridiculous.
Well, you got to get off Twitter. That's the you can't follow Elon Musk on Twitter.
Facebook groups I've had to leave because I just can't. It's just the number of people just giving their opinion is so bothersome. But when it's a constant negative opinion and people just saying, oh, I couldn't keep watching. I watched the first 20 minutes and had to shut it off. And it's like, thanks for telling me.
Yeah. I mean, there is a whole bunch of criticism. One thing that we're going to continue to do, both in this episode and in future episodes, is talk about the criticisms that are out there, responding to them, acknowledging when they're valid, sharing our own criticisms as we already have and as we'll continue to do. And we also recognize that we are just two guys sharing their opinions, but we hope that those opinions are balanced. And we hope that those are helpful to individuals who may be working through their own fandom, working through their own watching of the show, both in book readers who maybe want to enjoy the show despite having some of those negative reactions, and then also people who are more casual fans. Maybe they've seen the Lord of the Rings movie trilogy, maybe they've seen the Hobbit trilogy. They're coming back to Middle Earth without having read the Silmarillion, and maybe for some folks this is their first time entering Middle Earth. And they're trying to make sense of things. So we hope to kind of be a light in the dark, or a light in dark places.
And the big thing is we haven't drank the Kool-Aid on the show. So far, I've enjoyed it, but I'm not going to get up on a hill and say everybody should enjoy the show and watch the show. I can understand the Silmarillion fans that are upset about what they're seeing. I get it. There's stuff that's bothering me too, but I'm choosing to suspend disbelief in a lot of instances and just allow the story to be told. I'm not going to like every decision that they make, but I have really enjoyed some of the other decisions that they've decided to go with, like Galadriel's character in general. Instead of having her just sit in a forest and give advice for thousands of years, maybe she is doing some other stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So does Tolkien come out and say she was leading commandos in the Second Age? No. But this is one of those areas of liberty where I'm not offended that they're having a strong female character do something. That's something that was lacking in the Lord of the Rings books. And one of the things
with one major exception.
Eowyn.
Yeah, I mean, killing the Witch King.
Yes,
but yeah, there could have been more.
Only one out of a book of men is not enough. And that's one of the things that Peter Jackson does in the first trilogy that I really, while there's good and bad, I feel like when he created more of a space for Arwen to be involved instead of just being the damsel in Lorien living with her grandma, waiting for Aragorn to either die or succeed. In the books, that's basically how she's painted, and I'm not a huge fan of that. I'm also not a fan of how he took the character of Glorfindel, who is this amazing character legendarium, and then substitutes him for Arwen. I wish he would have kept Glorfindel in, but that's one of my nitpicky things. And straying way off topic.
Yeah, it's like you're about 3,500 years.
Yeah,
maybe closer to 4,500 years in the future. Going back to the recap. So we have
back to the Southlands.
Yeah, after the conversation in the memorial forest following the announcement of some of these elves being granted the right to sail to Valinor, we switch over to the Southlands, which for those who are looking at the map and know where this is all going, the Southlands is basically what will become the region of Mordor, where Sauron will eventually, take over complete dominion and turn it into his own land, and from which he will launch multiple invasions of the rest of Middle Earth. But for now, it is inhabited by human. We are told through dialogue that these humans were servants of Morgoth during the wars in the First Age, and as a consequence of that, there are elves sent there to watch over them. And one of these elves is Arondir. He is to us kind of on patrol through this human settlement. He goes to the tavern. There's an interesting conversation in the tavern happening when he walks in. There's talking about poisonings or poison grass, and it's a little hushed up when he comes in. Then there is he starts questioning the bartender about it. There's a young human who, let's say, has a negative reaction and says the phrase something along the lines of, "One day our true king will return," and I think something like, "Kick your pointy booted kind out of here," something along those lines. And then we do actually get our first discrete, I think this is our first discrete mention of any sort of timeline where, and I had to rewatch, when I was rewatching the episode, I turned closed captions on, and it really helped with some of the dialogue, especially when you start using dialect or accents. He says, 1,000, let's see, the lot you lump us in with died off 1,000 years ago. So from that, I'm assuming that we're around 1,000 years after the defeat of Morgoth, which makes sense. Galadriel earlier mentioned years turn into centuries and so on and so forth. So then Arondir kind of has a tense interaction with this young kid, and then leaves the bar and meets with Bronwyn, I believe is the pronunciation. She is a human woman. They have a flirtatious interaction, shall we say. There's some handing of seeds. There's some comments on healing.
We all know what handing of seeds really is.
Yes, yeah, no, but she gave him seeds. We then cut to her at home with her son. We hear that, there's some of the human characters, especially the same boy that Arondir had a confrontation with or tense interaction with in the bar, later gives Theo a hard time over both his mother's relationship with Arondir, and then also the fact that his true father's real father is gone and missing, and there's no explanation immediately produced. But then, so our scene at home between Bronwyn and Theo is interrupted by the same farmer. I don't know if you caught on to this, but the same guy who was in the bar talking about grass and poison grass then shows up at her cabin with his sick cow. They realize this cow is really sick because instead of milk, it kind of gives a black ooze. And then that kicks off Arondir and Bronwyn traveling to a neighboring settlement called Horden. I have to say, I think that's the end of, no, there is, I think, one more scene with them. They come upon the ruins of Horden toward the end of the show. But I have to say, this storyline immediately grabbed me. I like Arondir. I like the feel of the settlement. I think the slightly menacing humans are really interesting. This is like exactly the type of D&D campaign that I would want to play, right? And to me, this is the other great thing about this is these are brand new characters, never met before, completely creations of the show, and I was just immediately drawn into them. And I want to see what happens. I want to know if Arondir and Bronwyn have a seriously romantic history or just kind of been flirting for however many years. One thing we didn't mention is that Theo, the son, finds the hilt and a small part of a blade of a sword that has Sauron's sigil on it. I want to know, where did that come from? Whose was it? How did Theo know it was there? This is getting into the realm of speculation, but I think that bartender knows more than he lets on. It's just a really compelling, interesting storyline that I'm really looking forward to over the rest of this season.
And it does two things for me. The first thing is showing the connections between immortal elves and mortal beings. Arondir remembers the 1,000 years ago when these human ancestors sided with the great evil Morgoth. As we
Yeah.
get into episode 2, we have Elrond and Durin. And I'm just going to bring up this one line because it's topical at the moment. Durin says, 20 years for you is a blink. It's a lifetime for me. That's how long that he hasn't visited Durin. But they keep, and it's a theme so far, at least in the first 2 episodes, of these interactions, and also with Galadriel when she comes across the shipwreck at the very beginning of episode 2. It's the same thing. Elves remember more, and it's easier for them to keep track of who's trustworthy, who's not trustworthy, and people's deeds. But then it gets into the fairness of a modern context of, or a real context of, are you responsible for your ancestors' problems? And
Well, Arondir has the great line of the past is always with us, right?
Yeah.
And that's true for him, right? As you said. And then he has a really interesting conversation with the character's just called Watch Warden, who's, I'm assuming he is the commanding officer of their contingent of elves. And he says something along the lines of, we're not here because 1,000 years ago their ancestors sided with Morgoth. We're here because like something along the lines of they're still those people.
And we see, that's a good point, because there is racism between the cultures, and it goes every which way. You have elves or men hating elves with Tir Harad. You have elves hating men. You have the same situation with Galadriel. She has to hide her elven ears because she sees humans on a boat. His father, Durin, the third, I think.
Yeah,
can't remember.
I think he's during the third, and then his son is during the fourth, which we can talk about that. I don't think there were ever 2 Durins
at the same time
simultaneously because it's a reincarnation thing, but we don't know that. In the show doesn't tell us that that's why.
Seems to not be that way in the show. But then you have Durin the third basically shitting on elves to Durin at the end of episode 2. So this isn't anything new. I mean, this is throughout the books. Legolas and Gimli hate each other until they become friends and have this shared experience and actually get to know each other. But it is a common theme throughout Rings of Power at this point. You have the sprinkling in of Arondir, who, I don't know if that line you brought up, if he's referencing the past lives with us, like he's talking about elves, or if he's talking about everybody, like even humans are lumped into that group as well.
To me, I got the sense that Arondir was saying that is true. That is true for both elves and for humans.
Okay.
And maybe this will be part of his development over the season, is where he realizes that while it's true for the elves, it is not as true for the humans. Or maybe it's not true for all humans in the way that he thinks it is. For instance, I have to imagine that his relationship with Bronwyn is going to be a way of exploring that. I think there's a line, and forgive me if this is from episode 2, but she says something like, she says that, I'm from Horden. And I think he says, the people of Horden were particularly strong in their allegiance to Morgoth, right? So if he's thinking about what the people of Horden were like 1,000 years ago, she's saying, well, that's where I'm from. And she and he obviously have a connection. And I'm sure that he would see in her things that are good. Yeah, so that would have to be a theme in any sort of show where you have immortal elves, mortal humans, mortal dwarves, mortal Harfoots. And
which, now that we're bringing that up, we've only seen negative interactions between elves and men at this point. But in the Silmarillion, in the histories of Middle Earth, the group of humans that are faithful to elves or loyal to elves are the Númenóreans, and we haven't interacted with them yet. And I think that's important because I just realized it when Galadriel in the very beginning of episode 2 comes across the shipwrecked humans. They are from the Southlands, which is modern day Mordor or Tir Harad or whatever you want to call it. But we might actually get some elvish human interaction that's not entirely negative once we get some historically faithful humans. Basically the complete opposite of what Arondir is dealing with in Tir Harad.
Yeah, and I wonder if we are going to see Galadriel have to overcome any sort of prejudice she has against humans. Up to this point, Númenor has not been mentioned. I don't even think they've mentioned that there were faithful with a big F humans, the houses of the Edain. That would obviously that is a big part of Galadriel's biography in the Silmarillion, is what her brother did, who died so that a human could survive in their joint struggle against Morgoth. I realize that we still have some of the first episode to recap and the second episode to recap. So should we continue with that? You want me to finish up episode 1 and then we can jump into episode 2?
Or we can save episode 2 for tomorrow.
We could do that. So let's go ahead and talk about the rest of episode 1. Back with the elves of Linden, we have some dialogue between Gil-galad, who is the High King, and Elrond, where they discuss the decision to basically force Galadriel to go to take the ship to Valinor. And they basically acknowledge that they both agree with her basic position that Sauron is out there still. And I think Gil-galad has the line of, the same breath which seeks to extinguish something can fan the flames, basically something along the line. So the very search, the very struggle against Sauron will somehow continue to, perpetuate or strengthen him. I this is supposed to sound like wisdom, but it falls flat a little bit. I will say I've had so far a pretty negative reaction to the Gil-galad character, both in, the first thing that we see is Elrond writing his speech for him as if he's incapable of composing his own remarks.
Yeah, what did you say when we talked about it the other day? He's like a bad department store manager or something like that.
I don't know if that was my insight. Manager Gil-galad or something like that. Yeah,
he just seems like a Michael Scott to me at this point. Where
there you go. Yeah, Gil-galad is Michael Scott, even down to like the dark slick back hair.
Yeah, from season 1.
Yeah,
but like another bothersome thing for me, Gil-galad, one of my favorite characters. He is one of the greatest elves alive at this time in Middle-earth, and he has a very young half-elf Elrond writing speeches for him that he can't. That's one of the character changes that really has not stuck well with me in the first 2 episodes, and I'm hoping that it's only 2 episodes in. We're only a quarter of the way. Maybe they can begin to change his character a little bit. But even like the end of episode 1, where he basically admits, like you said, Sauron is still around, but then still convinces Galadriel to leave. And apparently she's one of their best soldiers at this point. So what like horrible leadership and decision-making to send your like elite commandos across the sea when you know that the guy that they were looking for is still around. Like that, it just doesn't make sense.
It doesn't. And I think this could be earlier. I think you said that you used the phrase Tolkien is rolling over in his grave, and I mentioned something about Elon, which Elon Musk did say that on Twitter. He said Tolkien's rolling over in his grave, and then he went on to say something about how like basically implying that all the male characters are stupid and bad and whatever, and only Galadriel is good. Now, obviously, that is not the case. You have Arondir. I think you have the male Harfoot characters are very strong. Obviously, in episode 2, you have Elrond and Durin have very good interactions. It is really in episode 1. It's primarily Gil-galad who just looks, again, he's the Michael Scott of Middle Earth at this point. And you mentioned like that could be offensive to book readers who see this as an epic character, but also on the screen, Gil-galad is, and in the Fellowship of the Ring, Gil-galad is described as the High King, the heroic High King of the elves who falls to Sauron,
the last king of the Noldor.
Yeah, and that is
Middle-earth.
In the Middle Earth. And so this is something that we should talk about kind of in like our meta criticism of kind of like how to do politics in a fantasy setting, because Tolkien does it differently than other writers do. We'll put a pin in that and return to it. Going back to our recap, which the recap is now at this point almost as long as the episode, the episode of television itself. So we'll get better. Everybody, this is episode 1, the first time that Sean and I have done a podcast. So forgive us our trespasses. Okay, so
we're finally at the last scene though.
We are. We're there. Why don't you close it out for us, because this leads directly into episode 2.
Yeah. So we end with Galadriel and her commandos. They are sailing across the sundering seas. And again, one of my like if there's one thing that this show does right, it's the visuals. The cinematography is top notch. When you see them sailing towards the Vale of Valinor and you see it open up, and I know people have mocked it as being like Monty Python, it seems out of place. But when you read the description of Valinor, like people have tried to sail there before, without permission. And the Silmarillion tells of them getting lost, and there's a lot of fog around it. And the way that they show that foggy, cloud-filled sky open up, that was a very good representation to me of what the veil around Valinor was supposed to look like. And I think they did a very good job with that.
Yeah, the otherworldliness of Valinor and of that transit really came through.
And you get it at the very beginning of the episode too, when it shows the ships leaving Valinor for Middle Earth. You can see the veil open up as they sail.
Yeah,
out.
which is an interesting decision to make. And we can come back to that when we kind of talk about some of the Valinor and kind of this new history of the Noldor that the show is there, and the new history of the elves. I don't think they've even used the phrase Noldor, nor will they, I imagine.
Because they can't.
Okay, so Galadriel and her companions are about to be basically raptured into Valinor, because this is elf heaven, and I don't mean to be kind of dismissive of that concept. That's what it is. Tolkien was a practicing Roman Catholic,
yeah.
and very much had an influence on his writing, and that is kind of what is depicted on screen. And then at the last minute, Galadriel makes a decision, and she picks up the dagger that originally had been Finrod's, and she jumps in the water. For those of you who are not watching, which is everybody, because this is a podcast, Sean picked up his, I'm assuming, Renaissance fair dagger.
It is, yeah, close at hand.
And so she jumps in the water, and she turns her back. She does not make the transit to Valinor, and we leave her floating in the dark sea, wearing nothing but a nightgown.
Which, this is one of those points that I completely agree with the critics. This is a decision that the writers made that, even if you tried to defend it, I don't think it makes any sense. If someone said, oh, well, she only had to swim overnight because she was picked up by a boat the next morning. And I'm just sitting there thinking, okay, sure, she only had to swim overnight. That is physically possible. That's something someone could do. But what if the boat wasn't there?
Yeah, no, she didn't have the script to episode 2 on the boat with her when she decided to jump in the water. The character of Galadriel made that decision without any concept made clear to the viewer of what that would require her to then go and do.
Yeah.
We don't get any sort of narration around, we've been sailing for a week or we've been sailing for a day. It's just they're there. And that is something that we should come back to this in the meta criticism section, because, or maybe just our own review section, because in fantasy, especially in Tolkien, what's The Hobbit about? It's about walking across the country. What is The Lord of the Rings about? It's about walking across the country. The journey is important. That idea has been kind of represented in fantasy as a major component of it. So if you look at the way that travel is treated in the show thus far, I think there are some problems that we can talk about, and some things that also just, man, I'm getting like late Game of Thrones vibes, right? With the teleporter and, you know, the overnight dragon express and things like that, that I really hope that we don't see any more of this, but we can talk about that in the in the direct criticism section.
See, that's actually one thing that doesn't bother me as much, though.
Okay.
Because the show itself technically takes place over a very vast amount of time. Do I need to see Elrond and Celebrimbor walking from Eregion to the gates of Khazad-dûm, like a scene later? No, I can, in my head, say, oh, okay, well, maybe 2 days have passed that they had to walk to the gates of Khazad-dûm.
Sure.
Now, I don't think it's gonna, I hope it doesn't get as bad as Game of Thrones, where they go straight from like everybody who's a protagonist was here, and then all of a sudden we're all here. As long as they can keep it scattered where storylines aren't intersecting the way Game of Thrones was, because then it was obvious in that final season where they were like, oh yeah, we just got to wrap this up. So, all right, everybody's in Winterfell. Okay, now everybody's in King's Landing.
Yeah, I would take it a step further and refine my earlier criticism to the point where, like, I think I didn't have necessarily a problem with time jumps in Game of Thrones that were necessary in the eyes of the writers to get people back together so we could have things like the battle at Winterfell against the Night King and his army. And then, well, the next big thing that's going to happen is the confrontation in King's Landing. So we're going to kind of ping pong between opposite ends of the continent. My problem was, even in a fantasy world, distance is still distance, and beings are only capable of traveling the distances that they are established in the show to be able to travel. So dragons cannot fly 1,000 miles an hour. Human beings cannot run faster than a regular human being can run. So when the whole like zombie kidnap plot happens and Gendry somehow runs back from beyond the wall, back to the wall, they send a raven flies to Dragonstone. Daenerys decides to get on her dragon and fly all the way from Dragonstone beyond the wall, perfectly finding this troop that was stuck in the middle of an island. And that seems to happen overnight. That's where, to your point about the suspension of disbelief in a fantasy world, it's broken for me. I can't do that anymore. Specifically because the show in season 1, episode 2, demonstrated how traveling from Winterfell down to King's Landing takes a really long time, and you're going slowly. So in my issue with Rings of Power and travel is not the Celebrimbor Elrond trip to Khazad-dûm. I have other issues with that. Primarily, you have 2 very high-ranking elves, and they're traveling on foot by themselves. There would be horses. There would be an escort. We'll put that separate.
We don't know. They could have made camp around the bend.
We could have. They could have. They could. That's fair. My issue is in the very first scene with Galadriel and the Elven commandos, after the mutiny, we cut, and the next time we see that group, they're back in Linden, and there's no mention of the mutiny. We don't even have a conversation where she is reconciled to her subordinates, basically, especially the guy who then later, when they're on the boat, reaches for her hand like he wants to accompany her into Valinor, when the last time that they were interacting, he was leading a mutiny against her. And I feel like there would have been conversations on that trip all the way back to Linden that we didn't get, because the characters don't seem like it seems like the relationship is kind of forced when they get back together. So that's my issue with the travel, is the journey is an opportunity for people to grow and develop. And we don't get that in these time jump, space jumps.
Okay. I'll just say, I don't see it as a problem yet. I think it could become one, but up to this point, doesn't bother me.
All right, well.
And I think at this point, we might want to save episode 2.
We probably should.
For another time.
We probably should. So the final thing that happens in episode 1 is the meteor. Based on at least the timing of seeing it cross the sky and having the various characters react to it, it seems like it travels west to east. It's seen by Gil-galad. It is seen by
Galadriel first.
Galadriel sees it on the boat?
After she jumps off, she looks up after the veil closes.
Okay. So Galadriel sees it. Gil-galad sees it. I'm assuming that those are Ents, because we don't have any other characters or anything like that. It's not mentioned that those are Ents, but we see some Ents in a shot. Who reacts to it first? Do the Harfoot see it first, or does Bronwyn and Arondir?
I don't even really recall, but I'm trying to remember. Oh, Arondir and Bronwyn aren't far east. They'd be south of where it landed, correct? If it crashed in Rovanion.
Yeah, I think the Harfoots seems like they're in Rovanion, kind of north of what will be Mordor, east rather of what will become Mirkwood, in that
where the Entwives are supposed to be. Speaking of Ents
and Entish matters. And so there is a meteor crashes near the Harfoot settlement. Nori, the main character in the Harfoot story, finds the crater where it landed and sees that there inside the meteor was a person, a large, seemingly human person. And then we end the episode. I will say that the one other notable thing about the meteor scene is in Gil-galad's reaction shot. I think following that, a leaf falls from a nearby tree and he turns the leaf over, and I had closed captions on, and so it showed on screen that it was black speech was there. black speech was being said, and the leaf kind of it looks like corruption spreads. It's actually reminiscent somewhat of the corruption in the cow that was giving kind of a black pus. Anyway,
And
so that's your
similar to the corruption during the destruction of the trees in Valinor as well.
And similar to that as well. So that is your episode 1 recap. That took us in real time.
Longer than the episode.
Longer than the episode. So we'll get better. We'll focus on moving our criticisms into a separate section and criticism and commentary. Yeah, but that is our episode 1 recap, and we will take a break and come back and talk about our other reactions.
Start to introduce is meta criticisms, so things that the shows touch on that the rest of I guess society as a whole is kind of weighing in on. A couple of those topics that we're going to talk about in this episode, very much in the zeitgeist, is diversity in fantasy, especially in Tolkien's works. So let's touch on that first. Sam, I'll let you start the conversation on this one.
Well, actually, this was something that you put down there, so I have thoughts on this, but I would defer to you if you wanted to kind of open it up.
Sure. There's been a lot of criticism about the decision of Amazon and showrunners to include a black elf, a black dwarf, darker skinned Harfoots. And there's been a lot of pushback. And it basically surrounds the idea of Tolkien never said that there were black elves. Tolkien never said that they were black dwarfs. So how can there be? And one of my biggest problems with it is like the whole idea of suspension of disbelief. If you are going to be okay with the idea that a god, basically, Aule, created dwarves from stone, you're cool with that. But gods forbid that Aule created a black dwarf. Like, it just doesn't make sense to me. And it goes throughout the entire fantasy genre. Even in D&D, they have a current issue where Wizards of the Coast is kind of backpedaling with their new Spelljammer release that they had, where when Spelljammer first came out decades ago, they had a playable race that was basically primates that were turned into bipedal soldiers, basically, by wizards. And they were going to be like enslaved and sold as like slave army. Now, the whole concept of primates being enslaved has a lot of racist undertones, and Wizards of the Coast didn't really catch on to it before Spelljammer was published. Maybe someone should have caught on to it, but they have since apologized for it, and they're removing that from the reprints going forward.
Wait, so question, because I mentioned that for all of our listeners out there, all of our one listener, I haven't played D&D actively in a couple of years. I was in graduate school, and one of the reasons that we're conducting this call over Zoom is that Sean is on the other side of the country, and so we're just not easy. It's not as easy to play D&D nowadays. So I've stepped away from D&D. I know that Spelljammer was coming out just kind of based on things that I saw online, but I don't have any history with Spelljammer. It's honestly shocking to me that D&D had this big of a blind spot in 2022, given all of the criticism that they have faced recently for other materials, even in 5th edition. Like, I think they had a reissue of Curse of Strahd, and there was a lot of criticisms over the depiction of basically astral gypsies being straight tropes
of the Roma population.
Exactly. Which, I mean, and that may be in the base literature, but the base literature was written, 100 years ago, 150 years ago. I don't know when Bram Stoker was writing, but I probably should. But and then you just with the popularity of Critical Role and the new groups that are coming into D&D to have something like that. It's shocking, but it's also not shocking, because I think at the end of the day, the people who work at Wizards of the Coast are the same guys that were working there, the same guys largely that were working there when it was TSR. And anyway, so.
But more like the biggest part that I'm trying to get across is the outrage of creating a more diverse series, I think, is incredibly misplaced. The show should be created for a modern time where diversity is celebrated. Anybody who watches the show should feel like it's for them. One of my biggest problems with the Jackson trilogy is that the only time you see a dark-skinned character, they're the evil Haradrim going to join Sauron in Mordor. It's like the only time you interact with them. They do have the moment of Faramir saying, I wonder if this guy was really evil at heart or if he's just been misled. But that's like a drop in the bucket of we're going to demonize this skin color by making them evil. And that's the only time we're going to introduce anybody that's not white.
And well, I think that is something that, correct me if I'm wrong, that dialogue is taken almost verbatim from the book. And I think it speaks to Tolkien acknowledging that reality, having been someone who himself fought in a war. He didn't fight in World War II, but he fought in World War I. But I think even in his letters, he talks about as World War II is being fought, kind of knowing the difference between the evil of Hitler and the soldier who is following orders. So I think, Tolkien had a nuance when it comes to that, where I'm glad it was portrayed like that in the Jackson films. But yeah, that was the only person of color. On the point of representation, what I always think of is my mom talking about how different it was when the Wonder Woman show was on TV, to see a female superhero, and the difference between the Wonder Woman show and then Superman, who, he had the Christopher Reeve movies were really big. I mean, this was back when my mom was a kid growing up, but like that was really important. And I think it's important that, as you said, fantasy is accessible for people, even if the original books were written by a white European guy who studied white European languages and mythologies, and then basically wrote what he kind of positioned to be the like national epic of what would become England. And I say England and not Great Britain, because he is very much Anglo-centric. And that's something that we will talk about in episode 2 in this section. And then just to there's also criticisms out there that are so they have to go out of their way to come up with rationales for why there wouldn't be black elves or black dwarves. And there's one criticism that I was seeing that was talking about how natural selection there's not enough time for natural selection to lead to the creation of melanin. So why is Arendir have a darker skin color? She's like, I didn't know that Tolkien incorporated natural selection into his biology of the elves. I thought they kind of just woke up on the shores of a lake under starlight. Oh, wait, that's exactly what happened. And you're telling me that, yeah, because of that reason that we don't have any elves of color. It's completely ridiculous. And it's also because these are fantasy characters. These people do not exist in the real world. Some of them don't even exist in the books that people are using to justify their anger and over the diverse cast. And so they can be whatever, their skin can be whatever color you want it to be. It's a fantasy character. When you read Lord of the Rings, Aragorn can look any way you want him to. He looks like Viggo Mortensen for many people because they see the movies, but that's not what he looked like. That's not what he looked like when Tolkien wrote the character. And it can look like whatever the reader or the viewer wants him to look like.
Yeah, Viggo Mortensen did not have gray contacts in during.
There you go.
The filming of the Peter Jackson trilogy,
which is one of the things that like that, and that is not just like he was in passing described as having gray eyes. Gray eyes was a trait associated with Numenorian lineage.
Mm-hmm.
And I think maybe Jackson realized that, well, either Jackson realized it didn't matter, or I think maybe the contacts actually really hurt Viggo Mortensen's eyes. There's some reason why they aren't included, but it was a minor detail, right?
Yeah.
It at the end of the day, it didn't matter. Now, the color of Galadriel's hair, we can, that might matter because it's relevant to the plot of the Silmarillion, and there may be a thread that they're going to pick up on that in the show. That was a very deliberate effort. Yeah. But for especially in a realm, in a setting where the color of one's skin doesn't matter, the people, the humans of Tir Harad don't dislike Arendir because he's dark skinned. They dislike him because he's an elf. And that's the important distinction between the fantasy and the reality. And in our world, we have bias and discrimination and hate based on skin color and religion and all sorts of other things. We don't have human elf relations. We don't have human dwarf relations. Those are the tensions that exist in the fantasy realm. So these other things, the criticisms are
Not
pretty
valid.
not, I must say they're not. I mean, I don't necessarily think they're valid. I think they're a waste of time. It's a distraction. I think it's the easy crutch if you don't actually want to dive into the things that are harder to criticize, like characterization and theme and other things like that. It's just, image on screen make me mad.
Yeah. And shout out to, in terms of diversity, shout out to Critical Role for like creating one of the most inclusive environments for fantasy, I think, ever.
Probably.
Pretty
Yeah.
high up
I mean,
there.
yeah, I think there were other shows, other either live play shows that, well, I don't think there's none that I know of that were as intentional as Critical Role was.
Yeah, but just with how, like you said, intentional, how purposeful they've been with being inclusive. Yeah, they're like the standard for what inclusive fantasy material should be. And
Yeah.
again, also props to Wizards of the Coast for recognizing and apologizing for the most recent issue that they've had. But one would hope that eventually they will get it right on the first publish so they don't have to republish constantly.
Yeah, but hey, they always enjoy making money selling you the same book twice. So
That is true.
The final thing I'll say is that one of the other reasons why I think this particular line of criticism is misguided and counterproductive is because if you want Amazon to dig their heels in on the show, this is the best possible way to do that, because then it's so easy to paint with a broad brush legitimate criticism as coming from people who are also criticizing them on the diversity point. So I don't, we're not talking about diversity so that we can get carte blanche to go ahead and shit on everything else about the show. This is how we genuinely feel, and we would like to enjoy the show. And if there are other folks out there that enjoy the show, that celebrate the diverse casting, but maybe have, questions, reservations, or some negative reactions to certain things they see, we hope to lift up that voice and that criticism, because, at the end of the day, maybe it will have an impact on what we see down the road.
Indeed. On the last topic for this section, this one is yours. So what is canon?
Yeah, I wrote that because all of these topics are related. I've seen people out there talking about certain things that were depicted in Lord of the Rings and talking about them as if that is what Tolkien wrote and that is what he intended. And no, that was a decision made by the filmmakers of the Lord of the Rings. And so certain architectural styles of the elves, for instance, certain other depictions, are a lot of the visuals that people have that they think should be the way that Middle Earth is depicted comes from the Lord of the Rings movies, which were great, which remain great, but that's not necessarily the image that was created in the mind of J.R.R. Tolkien when he wrote the books. And when it comes to certain characters, the character of Galadriel exists in the Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion and other various works that were published after J.R.R. Tolkien passed away. The only official published book in which she appears that was published during the author's lifetime is the Lord of the Rings. She's not her appearances are, she has a couple of appearances. She's not a main character. And much of the criticism of the way that she's depicted in the show relies on information that was published after the author had passed away. And what we are looking at is a period of time where there is relatively little detail about the life of Galadriel. So we know where she ends up. We know what happens, what she does in the Third Age and at the beginning of the Fourth Age. But the Second Age, in which the show takes place, is basically her journey to that point. And so when it comes to, what is canon, the show stands on its own. And I think this is a double-edged sword. The showrunners, the producers, the screenwriters of the show need to make a show that stands on its own. And leaving things unexplained, leaving character motivations vague, is going to undermine the effectiveness of the show and the quality of the show. On the other hand, the critics need to recognize that the show is going to stand on its own, and you can't overly wish that, oh, Galadriel should have been portrayed like this, or no, that's totally wrong, and JR, Tolkien spinning in his grave. No, he's not. He's not spinning in his grave. The Tolkien estate sold the rights to the show to Amazon. Amazon is making their version of a show, but the books are still there. Tolkien's in his grave.
Dead.
He's right side up. He's dead. He will remain dead. Anyway.
And with that too, like Tolkien himself sold the rights while he was alive. So at that point, he's basically washed his hands of it. So yeah, I don't know. I'm with you, especially in terms of people complaining. To me, I look at it and I go, okay, well, it's not canon. It's not changing the books. The books still exist. If you want to go back to your hyper-specific view on what the Noldor and Valinor and the First Age and Second Age is like, go read the Silmarillion.
Yeah.
And
if you want to see it on screen, found a company, make hundreds of billions of dollars, buy the rights, and then make it yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Or, you know what? There's always Tumblr and blogs and whatever. Write your own fan fiction.
Start a podcast.
Yeah.
Final segment that we're going to install into this show is called Not Nerdy Enough. We are not equipped to run a podcast on Tolkien and other fantasy topics. We're just fans of the material. So this quiz, I think while we're doing Rings of Power, it might be Tolkien specific, but once we get past the season of Rings of Power, we might branch out into D&D quiz questions, maybe some Witcher questions, things like that. But we have a quiz. We're going to alternate back and forth. Sam is going to be up first to see if he's nerdy enough to host this podcast.
Let's do it.
We have 10 questions. They range from pretty easy T-balls to tougher questions, all within the realm of Tolkien's Legendarium. So the first question, what is Frodo's father's name?
Oh, God. Oh, Drogo.
Correct.
Yeah.
Question 2, how many wizards came to Middle-earth to combat Sauron?
5.
Correct. For a bonus, can you give me their colors?
There were the 2 blue wizards.
Yep.
Radagast the brown, Gandalf the gray, later Gandalf the white, and Saruman the white, later Saruman of many colors.
Good job. Question 3. What is the original name of Minas Morgul before being occupied by the enemy?
Minas Ithil.
Correct. Which elf fought Morgoth and inflicted 7 wounds before being defeated?
Mentioned earlier in this podcast, that would be Fingolfin.
Correct. Which of the Valar was the Lord of the Dwarves? Mentioned multiple times.
Mentioned multiple times, both in this podcast and in the show. That would be Aule.
Correct. Number 6, after the events of The Hobbit, what was the name of Gandalf's sword?
Gandalf took Glamdring.
Correct.
The bow hammer?
I believe so.
Okay.
In what famous city was Glamdring constructed?
Gondolin.
Correct. What does JRR stand for?
God. John Ronald Rule?
Yes, bonus points for being able to spell rule.
Ruehl.
Nope.
Damn it.
Reuel.
Reue. There's no H?
No, no H.
Oh, okay.
Question 9. In what forest can Old Man Willow be found?
The Old Forest.
The Old Forest, correct. And final question for a solid 100% on this quiz. What is the name of the waybread given to the Fellowship by the elves of Lothlorien?
Oh, I know this, and I will go even deeper. It is lembas bread. The recipe for lembas was taught to Galadriel while she was residing in the kingdom of Doriath, and she was taught it by Melian the Maya, queen of Doriath, wife of Luthingel.
And that is 100%. You are nerdy enough to host this podcast today.
All right. Well, next week, tune back in, or I don't know if it's next week, but next episode, tune in to see if Sean is nerdy enough to host this pod as I take the reins of Quizmaster and throw at him the deepest of the deep cuts from the Legendarium of J.R.R. Tolkien.
Yeah, that is it for episode 1. We look forward to discussing more topics going forward as new episodes of Rings of Power come out. There will be an episode shortly for episode 2 because they were released back to back. But yeah, Sam, do you have any other closing statements you would like to make?
I have tons, but this podcast could go on forever. So I will save them for the next episode and between the episodes. And then when I'm lying awake at night, I'll come up with more thoughts, I'm sure.
All right, and we'll sign off with that.
All right, until then, stay nerdy, my friends.